All right, great. Hi, everyone. It's 2:30. We are live. Welcome to our webinar. It's our first one. This webinar, we will explore the conditions of federal prisons during the pandemic, the negligence of the BOP while the death toll continues to rise in the prisons, and how Muslim political prisoners are left out of the solutions and what we are doing now to help. So we have a great lineup of speakers today. We'll be starting off with Daniel McGowan. He is a New York activist and also a former political prisoner. We will have Mel Underbakke, our executive deputy director, and also Kathy Manley, who is our legal director. First, I'd like to introduce the Coalition of Civil Freedoms for those who are unfamiliar with our organization. Our mission is to defend civil liberties and freedoms, to promote a fair US criminal justice system, and to advocate for the rights of political prisoners targeted in the war on terror. So we were established in 2010 as the result of the Muslim community being targeted for terrorism after 9/11. We deal with entrapment cases, sting cases against vulnerable victims, and false imprisonments and lengthy sentences, sometimes up to life sentences. There are currently over 200 Muslim political prisoners incarcerated in the United States. So first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I am the Family and Prisoner Coordinator for the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. And what we've been seeing ever since the pandemic has hit is a lot of chaos in the prison system. A lot of prisoners are scared. And what we've seen is a lot of delays and inaction by the Bureau of Prisons, which has resulted in the death tolls continuing to rise, making these people more and more vulnerable every day as the pandemic is spreading to more and more facilities. So now first, I'd like to introduce our first guest, Daniel McGowan. In 2007, Daniel was convicted of charges relating to his environmental activism. And oddly enough, he was given what's called the terrorism enhancement, which makes him have a connection to our prisoners, as this is something that they also have. The enhancement is used to give lengthy sentences to charges, sometimes doubling and tripling what someone's sentence would be. So Daniel is here with us today. The reason I invited him is because he's really been tracking since day one everything the BOP has or actually hasn't been doing. So he's going to give you a great overview of what our friends, neighbors, loved ones are dealing with in the prison system. Daniel, it's all you.
Thank you. Sorry, I was putting myself on the clock, Ashley.
Okay.
So yeah, like Ashley said, my name is, sorry, I'm just getting this together. I am getting used to the webinar thing, so sorry for this moment here. Like Ashley said, my name is Daniel McGowan. I'm a former political prisoner, and I did 7 years in the Bureau of Prisons for my involvement with a group called the Earth Liberation Front close to 20 years ago. I was housed for most of my sentence in the communication management units at both Marion and Terre Haute. I was the original plaintiff on the Aref v. Holder case, which is a lawsuit filed by the Center for Constitutional Rights, filed in 2010 actually, which is amazing. It's been 10 years. It's now called Aref v. Barr because the Attorney General is now William Barr, who's a monster from the 90s. He was Attorney General back then as well. And I, like Ashley said, I've lived and broke bread and shared, a lot of moments with many of your sons, fathers, and brothers during my 4 years at the CMU. So I'm not like a neutral party here. I'm not an academic, and I don't try to take on a neutral point of view in any way. I don't trust the Bureau of Prisons at all. I find them to be a sneaky, unaccountable agency run by people who really don't care one iota about the people in their custody. Their actions taken since COVID amount to smoke and mirrors, foot dragging, and hostility towards any kind of public accountability. And my experience, both residing in the Bureau of Prisons and suing them, has led me to conclude that their methods for dealing with most problems are just to obscure, to obstruct, to deny, to hide, and to shift responsibility onto others. But they are very interested in making it look like they're doing things. So if you went to the BOP COVID site, you would be like, wow, this is amazing. Look at all these links and all these amazing things that they're doing and testing and press releases and such. But it's largely nonsense. So I'm just going to give you an overview. I've been constantly staring at the BOP. Sorry, I'm just changing this. 1 second. I've been staring at the BOP website pretty obsessively for years, but since COVID, I've been really concerned. I'm generally concerned with the plight of people in prison, as well as I have a lot of friends that are left behind, people that I ran into, did time with, that I'm concerned about. So I am spending a lot of time looking at their statistics. And so I want to give you just an overview of the stats. So if the BOP was a state or its own Department of Corrections, it would be like the second or third largest in the country, maybe behind California and Texas. The total population of the BOP is 140,369 people. It's at 122 facilities managed by the BOP, and then about 11,161 people at various halfway houses and home confinement. The BOP staff population is 36,000. So as of yesterday, I'll give you the most updated stats. There are 2,646 COVID positive prisoners. I think that is probably a very low number, even though they are increasing their testing. That's probably extremely low. There's currently 244 COVID positive BOP staff. What's amazing about that number is that it went down from 365 to 244 in 1 day. There's a lot of stuff going on where the statistics are being sort of presented in ways that I think favor the Bureau of Prisons and makes it look like they're doing a lot. But I don't understand how there's over 100 people where the number of infections went down. I'll also say that there's 44 federal prisoners that died in BOP custody, and 1 staff person has died. For some reason, and I've yet to figure this out, and I've been asking journalists to help me with this one, the BOP doesn't disclose or doesn't count that person who is a case manager at USP Atlanta on their website. I think ultimately the new director of the BOP wants to say at the end of all this that no staff members died. And so even though there's been news reports by CBS, they're just not talking about it. I don't really get that. And frankly, it's not the main part of my concern, but it is interesting. Those numbers that I just mentioned are represented currently at 50 BOP facilities and 22 halfway houses. And this number is a little sketchier. I don't understand how exactly they're figuring it out, but they say 579 people in prison have recovered since this began. Now, like I said, the BOP is like 122 institutions. And so one thing I've noticed is every time I read their press releases, which are boilerplate, generic language, they call people inmates. They constantly refer to everyone as having pre-existing medical conditions. They've literally said that all 44 people had pre-existing medical conditions. I think that the point of that is suggesting that it's actually the person in prison's fault because they were sick and had medical conditions. And then COVID just kind of took advantage of the situation. And it points away from sort of BOP accountability and their refusal to create a situation in which people can actually socially distance. So the deaths are spread out amongst the different custody levels, but there is one thing I've noticed, and I'll go through the different custodies. So far, 25 people have died at low security prisons. 9 have died at mediums. 7 have died at administrative facilities, which are a mixture of different custodies, or medical centers. 1 person died at a maximum security prison, and 2 people have died at halfway houses. So you might be wondering why is it so many at lows? Well, there is a pretty significant minority of people in the Bureau of Prisons that are in low security prisons. I believe it's 35,000. And the thing is, and the reason why I think COVID is damaging, so damaging in that environment, is that people in low security prisons and minimum security prisons or camps are housed in dormitories. And dormitories are notorious for either bad airflow, stagnant air, no windows, and HVAC, like housing, ventilation, and air conditioned systems that go through that essentially just pull air from one part of the unit to another. I mean, I was telling someone recently that like someone could be making a dish on the other side of the dorm and you'll smell it. And so to me, that kind of suggests that COVID and any kind of infection will spread rapidly in dormitories. And it is interesting, one person died at a maximum security prison. Maximums and mediums are largely cell-based. Butner has had an outbreak and has had a number, Butner medium 1, but I haven't been able to figure out whether or not that's a dorm or a cell. Either way, there's obviously an outbreak there. So what you're seeing is a lot of people, up to 70 people in one room with, and also being on a lockdown, because when you're on a lockdown in a low security prison, you are restricted to your cube. And when you are on the top bunk, there is a tiny divider next to you that's maybe 6 inches tall. And so what you end up doing through, like, just based on good manners, is you sleep head to toe. So your neighbor's feet will be near your face. But that doesn't exactly really create any distance between you and your neighbor. And so if you're sick, your neighbor's going to get sick. One interesting fact about the deaths also that because like I said, I've been reading all the press releases, is that a large minority of the people that have suffered fatalities are often people with sex offenses. And again, that's like a quizzical, like, why would that be the case? Again, people with sex offenses largely are held at low security prisons and minimum security prisons. Now, they could actually have a very long sentence, but they're held at those facilities because those people are usually not able to exist in the higher security environment, because the higher security environment is usually run by the people that live at the prison themselves, and people generally have there's quite as in out here, there's quite a stigma against people with sex offenses. And I understand it's a complicated issue, but I tend to be, look at this a little broader in terms of, I don't have the same ideas as a lot of people that I've run into during my time in prison about sex offenses. I mean, I tend to view it like we're all sent to prison. We have to make do with what we have. It's like you choose who you socialize with. But at the end of the day, the fact that COVID is, killing a large amount of these people, to me, it's the same as for anyone else. So I'm not going to go into the BOP like optics, because I feel like it's largely nonsense. They have a lot of stuff on their website, like these action plans, and they have like, they put it on all capitals, like phase 1, phase 2. They claim that they started talking about this in January. I find that hard to believe, but in what most of us will remember is that in mid-March, they launched their action plan phase 2. And that was the cancellation of the social visits, severely limited legal visits, slowing down movement but not stopping. And then they started talking about screening. And then on April 1st, they instituted their first 14-day lockdown. They also talk again about decreasing movement. And they're saying they're going to try to operate, as normal within limits, which means, what they say on the BOP site is very different from what like the reality is. Because the anecdotal evidence is that people are sick. The anecdotal evidence is that they're being given things like ibuprofen, that you have to be very sick to leave the units, that there is no way to socially distance. I know of one case at Danbury, which is a low security prison in Connecticut, that has had an outbreak and death, that a person that applied for compassionate release was warned that if they did that, they would be sent to the Federal Medical Center. Sort of as like, you're going to get sent away from your family, you're going to be stuck at this FMC, where there are a lot of other sick people, whether from COVID or from other, people at FMCs are often dying of like terminal illnesses, because the BOP, like every prison system, incarcerates a tremendous amount of older people, and older people are more prone to like diseases, obviously. So I have just 2 more sections I want to say. I put myself through some misery last night watching the message from the BOP director. And it really was like eye-opening, because like you, maybe you hang out with a lot of people that you share the same opinion or share, they're like-minded people. Well, Michael Carvajal did a 6-minute message. He's the new director of the BOP. He's been there for like 6 months. And it was pretty horrible. I mean, he talked about it being National Corrections Week, which I thought was tacky. He bragged about the Unicor factories, which are the prison slave labor factories, making 1 million face masks. And he actually claimed that the one he was wearing was the 1 millionth, which I found hard to believe. He downplayed the numbers, suggesting that the fact that there is COVID infections at 50 prisons of 122 is no big deal. And I mean, I had to do the math, but I'm like, that's like 41%. I don't understand how having a serious illness at 41% of your prisons affecting thousands of people is like not a big deal. And his biggest problem was that he said that the people that work in corrections are heroes, and they are doing this work while enduring constant criticism and no solutions offered by the outside. And what he means by that is advocates, family members, lawyers, journalists, people that actually care. Now, the truth is that like there are solutions. They're not perfect solutions, but there are some solutions. And I don't believe that Michael Carvajal or the Bureau of Prisons, Department of Justice really care about that. But I will talk about a few different things, and I'll wrap up. In thinking about this, like how to respond as an advocate, I've often thought like, well, what can we do, right? Like what can we actually do to help our people? I think we all know that clemency is not exactly a strategy that's going to work. The silly fascist president is not giving anyone clemency, and if he was giving clemency, it would be to people that not very much like or very different than the people we're talking about, the family members. The smarter thing seems to go with something like home confinement, and I think Mel is going to talk a lot about that. I'll say that home confinement is often sounds great. It tends to be a non-starter for people with terrorism offenses, and I use that word very lightly, but it is what it's called. And because the fact is that right now, as it is, Bill Barr's 2 memos identify the standards by which people will be considered for home confinement, and it excludes a remarkable amount of people. It excludes all terrorism cases whose if your primary offense is violence, like mine, anyone with a detainer, which is like if you, for instance, are not a U.S. citizen and you're going to get deported, that's like 30,000 people. And anyone who has had an incident report in the last year, which is also a remarkable amount of people. It's very easy to get incident reports. Another strategy, compassionate release, and I know Kathy's going to talk about that. That's a very good strategy, but it's an individual one. Before the First Step Act, there had been a roughly 25 or so compassionate release petitions nationwide every year. And now, since the First Step Act, which is December 2018, there's been 257 people who have gotten reductions in their sentence via compassionate release. That's the BOP's number. I actually think it's a lot higher because of all the cases that I'm seeing. But and Kathy will talk a lot more about that. It's pretty complicated, but a very good strategy, but not one that addresses the masses of people that really require help. And there are some miscellaneous ways. There's transfers to another prison with more space. The problem with that is it's not incredibly feasible, as most of the prisons are fairly full. They're not beyond capacity like they were 10 years ago, but they are fairly full. In some of the court cases, for instance, the ACLU of Ohio sued Elkton, that's a low security prison, and the judge said that they must release people, including but not limited to compassionate release, we talked about, parole, which hasn't existed in the federal system since 1987, community supervision, which would be like supervised release, which would require a judge to put the person on supervised release, transfer furlough, which is just a transfer. So there's not a lot, right? Like, and so I sort of view COVID as a bit of a tornado. Like you try to run from I'm from Brooklyn. I don't know anything about a tornado, but you try to run from the tornado. You try to get it, but eventually you're like, you know what? I'm too far. I have to shelter in place. And so the problem with that is that the BOP has been very resistant to making the changes, because the biggest change they would have to make would be reducing the amount of people in the system. And that is where we are stuck. And that is why sheltering in place is a hard thing to tell your loved one they need to do when they know that they're in a room full of 60 people, a prison full of 1,500 people. That is the hard part. So we can argue, and I think we should, for better healthcare, personal protective equipment, everything like that. But at the end of the day, we just have to be real with ourselves that The problem is that prisons are crowded, and they are less crowded than they used to be, but they are still crowded. I mean, your loved ones can tell you what it's like to walk around a track or walk around a yard where it's like, excuse me, you're just packed, right? And right now, people don't even have the means to do that. They're not really allowed to go out to that extent. So anyhow, that's just my overview of the BOP. I can talk about this forever, but I don't want to bore you. I'm over time. I appreciate you having me on this, I almost said podcast, on this webinar, but thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, so much. I just wanted to mention we will be doing live question and answers at the end of this. So if questions come up while you're listening to us, please type it into the box, whether you're on Facebook Live, whether you're with us on Zoom, and we will answer your questions at the end of this webinar. So Daniel did a really great overview. He spoke about some of the disqualifiers for home confinement, which our next guest, Mel, is going to elaborate on. One thing that I've noticed is that specifically where my brother is, the prisons have come out with a list of who is eligible for home confinement in that area. For the camp at my brother's facility, they've said that 58 prisoners are eligible for release to home confinement. The problem is that they're not releasing those prisoners. So we are seeing that the solutions that are given, not only are they limiting it to who they are given to, but the ones that are eligible for it, they're not even moving forward with. And that's probably the biggest problem, is the inaction and holding on to people, while what we've seen happening is outbreaks just devastating the facilities that they do hit. So now I want to turn it over to Mel. Mel is our deputy executive director. She was with the coalition at its founding, at its inception in 2010. She started this work in 2003 during the Sami Alarian trial. And she's been doing this work ever since, fighting on behalf of those who are unjustly accused of terrorism. So Mel, please tell us a little bit more about Muslim political prisoners and what they're facing as far as being taken out of the solution for home confinement.
Oh, okay. I think, was I muted there? Okay, I'm going to start over. Thank you, Ashley, in case I was muted, for that introduction. And Daniel, thank you for all that good information about the Bureau of Prisons. I may be repeating some of that, so just bear with me, but it's probably important information. As you know, the one thing you mentioned was that as of yesterday, there were 2,646 prisoners who tested positive, and that was up about 700, I believe, from the previous day, if I remember right. So it's going up very dramatically. It's probably much higher than they're saying because they are not testing a lot of places. I heard from a prisoner yesterday that at Terre Haute, they are not testing the prisoners at all, or at that point they were not. And he didn't believe they were testing the staff either. So who knows how many cases there are. You know, he says that the prisoners there, believe that they're just hoping for herd immunity with time, and that, well, you know, obviously that's going to cause a lot of deaths. So I was thinking, you know, I've been in, you know, the sheltering in place here for about 2 months, like almost everybody has been during this COVID outbreak. And so one of the things we do here that I am able to do is follow the instructions of washing my hands frequently, wearing a mask when I go places. And I just really haven't been any closer than 10 feet from anybody in about 2 months now. You know, and when I go to the store, I wear gloves, and when I come home, I wash the gloves. And so I can be very careful. But if I was in a prison, I wouldn't be able to do any of that stuff. Daniel mentioned a lot of that. I know I've had prisoners tell me they were in the cell with somebody that obviously had COVID-19, it's obvious to them, and they were not removed from that cell. I mean, you're too close, and you can't get away from people. You maybe don't have access to soap and water at all times. I've heard other people say they finally got a mask, but you know, they had to wait a month or so, and they only got one mask. It has to last them, they don't know how long. so entirely, it's a very dangerous situation in a prison, and it's just, it's like a cruise ship or a nursing home. Very good place to grow viruses. So it's kind of critical to get out. And just to say about, Attorney General Bill Barr, he did recognize that lockdown isn't necessarily going to solve the problem, and there's, releasing would be better. And I think Daniel talked about that, but it's like March 26th, he issued his first memo to the BOP to start releasing people to home confinement, which is not freedom, as they're still being confined, but just at home, which would be a little safer. And then the CARES Act gave them a little more power, so it gave a more forceful memo on April 3rd. But as Daniel mentioned, that excludes a lot of people. And it excludes a lot of the people that we advocate for. And another thing he did then, he reinstated this requirement that people have served 50% of their cases in order to be released. And so Ashley also mentioned that there's over 200, mostly Muslim prisoners that we advocate for. And they have been convicted of terrorism-related charges. And so they're not going to, they don't qualify for this, this home confinement because of this pandemic. And because of the terrorism enhancement that goes on their sentences, most of them have got far longer sentences than they would have for a similar charge if it wasn't considered terrorism. And so that also means they probably are not going to qualify because they probably haven't served half of their sentence yet. And the rationale for this is community safety. But what's important to notice is these prisoners that I am talking about, none of them have been convicted of violence, and they weren't charged with violence for the most part. They're charged with material support to terrorist organizations or whatever, and then nobody thinks they were violent, and nobody was killed, nobody got injured. So why can't they be released? They're not violent. And some of them were really important community members before they were imprisoned. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples. One is the Holy Land Foundation, which was in Texas, the largest Islamic charity in the United States. They did a lot of good for people all over the world, including here in the United States. After the Oklahoma City bombing, they were the first ones there donating blood and just helping in general. I'm in Iowa right now, and years back, Iowa had very bad floods, and the Holy Land Foundation was here helping. And so these are good people. And they also helped hospitals and different people in Gaza and in the West Bank. And they did this through the same Zakat committees that our government used to give help to those people. But then they were arrested in 2007, and they're charged with providing material support to terrorism. And what they did was they provided humanitarian aid to needy people in the West Bank and Gaza. And at the trial, the government never claimed that they were violent. They just said, they were providing aid to those people in the West Bank and Gaza. But after 2 trials, they were actually convicted. Because of the terrorism enhancement, they got very long sentences. The 2 founders, Ghassan Alashi and Shukri Abu Bakr, were sentenced to 65 years in a federal prison. So these men were in their 50s at the time. And so this was basically a life sentence for them. And as everybody that knows them, I've never met them personally, but they say these are not just good people, these are just very, very good people. And they are not the only examples of people like that who are now in prison on very long sentences and not at all dangerous. But I want to move to another type of person, and that would be they were younger people, more vulnerable and at-risk people who are befriended by paid informants, by the FBI informants, and they're happy that this older person paid attention to them and befriended them, So these informants, what they do is, they talk to the people, but sometimes they give them jobs. They just talk about things like killing infidels overseas or various things like that, and they record them. And they kind of poke and prod, and they take them along, and they end up with a plot created by the FBI informant. And then the FBI solves its own plot, and these other people, the victims of this go to jail for often long sentences. I want to give a couple examples of that also. One was Mohammed Alessa, and his friend Carlos Almonte. When Mohammed was 16 years old, he had the first informant came to him and started working on him. And he was, at the time, it was very vulnerable. And 16 is very, very young. So he's flattered that this older guy's paying attention to him. So the man just talks about all these things that they can do, and he records everything. And after 4 years, and I believe that was also in 2007, if I remember right, he decided got talked into getting on an airplane to go to Egypt, and Muhammad thought he was going there to study Arabic. So so he was that was the sting. He was arrested, and they're charged with conspiracy to maim and murder people overseas. Because they're an attempt to connect with Al-Shabaab, which was a designated terrorist group by our government. And they had no connection to Al-Shabaab. They had never even mentioned Al-Shabaab, but they did do things like they saved money. They lifted weights to get in shape. They played paintball. And that's what they confessed to, basically. And they're facing a life sentence. The lawyer's telling them what will happen if they don't reach a plea agreement, which most likely they will be punished for it. And so the life sentence or maximum 30 years. So they both reached the plea agreement, pled guilty. Muhammad was sentenced to 22 years, and Carlos was sentenced to 20 years. And this is somebody with, I say, just a kid. He was led there by the FBI, creating their own plot and then solving it. And, they got another terrorism conviction. And I'm going to give one other example of, somebody I've actually known pretty well, is Zia Jagi. I believe he was 18 when the FBI first started following him around. And his conviction, he had nothing anywhere, but his conviction was conspiring to provide material support to an unknown terrorist organization at an unspecified time, at an unspecified place, or something close to that. And he, knew he was innocent, so he did not plead guilty. He did not take the plea agreement. And out of this case, it was a cell of 7 people, I believe. Zia got the longest sentence. He was sentenced to over 30 years. And the other members, the original target only got 18 years because he did take a plea agreement and he cooperated, as I say, with the FBI. And I say this is just many cases. One place you can read about this, and I think maybe Kathy may talk about this more later, is have a report that was just updated, Inventing Terrorists, a Lawfare of Preemptive Prosecution, which looks at the cases that the government said were convicted terrorists, successful convictions of terrorists. And they examined those cases to see where did these people, did they have a terrorist threat? And they found that, again, this is an updated version. Once again, they found over 90% of them did not pose a terrorist threat. So I'm going to kind of conclude there. I think I say they said, wait, there's over 200 of these people, and they are, again, not violent. There's no reason, there's no danger to the world at all. They could be at home confinement, except for the law that they have to do, can't be terrorists or violent people. And I really hope that law is changed. And I say keeping them in prison could change these really long sentences to a death sentence. And at that, I'll turn it back to Ashley.
Thank you so much, Mel. That's a great overview. As we mentioned before, Mel just spoke about only a few of the over 200 Muslim political prisoners currently incarcerated here in the United States. So next, I would like to turn it over to our legal director, Kathy Manley. She practices in the state of New York and has been doing this work since 2004 when she became the defense lawyer for Yassin Araf. It was a case out of Albany, New York, where a local imam was accused of terrorism in an elaborate sting operation, which he was totally innocent of. And she's been doing this work ever since. So we've talked about what's wrong and how the solutions aren't being given to certain groups of prisoners, but now Kathy's going to kind of uplift you a little bit with what she is doing to kind of solve these problems and help some of our guys. Kathy, take it away.
Thanks, Ashley. I don't know how successful we'll be, but we are certainly trying. I wanted to go back to what Daniel was saying at first and talk a little bit about the BOP statistics and how basically you can't trust them. Mostly when people report statistics on COVID, like cities and states and towns, they do it on a cumulative basis. They count all the positive tests, and then when somebody recovers, they don't subtract that from the total. They'll say the number recovered, but they won't subtract it from the total. BOP seems to be subtracting a lot from their totals because what I'm obsessed with it like Daniel. I look at their statistics every day in every facility, and you'll see maybe there's 40 inmates at one particular facility that are positive one day, and then the next day they'll say it's 20. So what happened? They didn't release them, they didn't transfer them, they didn't miraculously improve, but maybe they got better, but they shouldn't be subtracting them anyway. So that's just one example. And also, a lot of times the facilities are supposed to report their numbers. A lot of times they'll just lie. And so sometimes there'll be media reports based on doctors' reports and guards at the prison saying, and nurses at the prison, and saying, yes, these people are tested positive, they clearly have it, and BOP isn't counting them. For instance, that happened with Chicago MCC. There were a lot of news reports about a lot of cases there that BOP was ignoring, not reporting in their totals. And once the media report came out, all of a sudden they started counting them. So, if we hear about a lot of cases that aren't being reported, I hope that we can reach out to journalists and try to get them to investigate and hopefully get those reported. But the other thing is they're not testing. So there's way more cases than they're admitting to anyway because they're not testing. But I really wanted to talk about compassionate release. And that is something that was almost never done before the First Step Act passed, as Daniel said. And the First Step Act went into effect in the beginning of 2019, basically. And I guess he said 257 people were granted over basically 2019. And then this pandemic hit. And we were already looking at some of our people who might have been eligible for compassionate release before the pandemic. And that would be people who are over 65 and have serious chronic medical conditions that aren't going to get better and are having a difficult time in prison because of it. And we were starting to work on that. And then the pandemic hit. And we thought, wow, now these people are very vulnerable to it. And some other people are also vulnerable to it who are not eligible under the standards before the pandemic. Because we looked at our 200 people that we support, and Mel talked about the kinds of cases, and it would be good if somebody could put up the link to our Inventing Terrorists report so you can see the kinds of unfair cases that the people that we support were convicted in and got outrageous sentences. So we looked at our 200 people after the pandemic hit and looked at how many are over age 60 and how many have these medical conditions that make them vulnerable to COVID, which is things that affect the kidneys, things that affect the lungs, things that affect the immune system, things that affect the heart, basically. And we identified about 30 people. and we started working on compassionate release motions for those people. The first thing they had to do was submit an application to the warden requesting compassionate release. And the warden, we know, are going to deny it. They're basically denying all of them, even though they know that a lot of these people are very vulnerable to the virus. And even in facilities where there's a lot of cases, they're not granting. I don't know of any cases where the warden has granted it. Do you, Daniel? I don't know. Even one, okay, one. So we knew that that wasn't going to happen with our cases, especially. And they're not eligible for home confinement if they're convicted of these ridiculous terrorism related cases. We have one person who's eligible for home confinement. He may or may not get it. First, he was told he was, then he was told he wasn't. Now he's told he was again. That's Rafael Dafir. So hopefully he'll get home confinement next week. We're watching that. But we started preparing these compassionate release motions for a lot of people. And the first one that I worked on was Mohammed Al-Mazain from I was working on another one before, but not counting that. That was pre-pandemic. The post-pandemic ones, the first one was Mohammed Al-Mazain, who Daniel said, you gotta do something for him. He's in Elkton and he's old and he doesn't have much time left to serve anyway. I said, yeah, you're right. So, and I was looking at him anyway, so I'd already written to him. And so I prioritized that one because he is in, not Elkton, he's in Oakdale. I'm sorry. That's another place where there are a lot of cases. So he submitted it to the warden. I submitted a draft of the motion to his attorney because this is one of the Holy Land people that Mel was discussing. They are people who got, basically, two of them got life sentences, and these other people got really long sentences for basically being humanitarians. For being good people, they got punished really drastically. And so they had actually some of the best criminal defense lawyers in the country: Josh Stratel, Linda Moreno, Nancy Hollander, John Klein. These were their attorneys. And these attorneys, if you ask them about this case, they will say this is the worst injustice they've ever seen, because these are people who not only didn't do anything wrong, they were doing things right. And that's why they're in prison. They were helping the most vulnerable people in Gaza, and it was nothing violent. And the prosecution didn't even claim that it was violent. It's just crazy that these people are in prison. So anyway, Josh Stratel, I gave him my draft. He said, yes, thank you. I'm going to put it together and write more about the case because he knows more about the case itself, the details. He was the trial attorney. So he's filing that right away now. And I'm also working on them for Shukri Abubakar and Ghassan Alashi, and also working with their attorneys. So I sent a draft for Shukri Abubakar a couple days ago to Nancy Hollander, and she's gonna, I think they're waiting to see kind of what happens with Mohammed Al-Mazain's first, to see kind of how the judge is handling it, but that should be filed pretty soon. And I had a legal call, and I had never talked to any of these guys before from the Holy Land case because they already had good lawyers. And I did have a legal call with Shukri a couple days ago, and oh my God, what an amazing guy. He's one of the best people you can ever meet. Just, it reminded me of Yasin Arif, the guy that got me into all this in the first place, who's now released and in Kurdistan. We were supposed to be visiting him in April, but got put off because of the pandemic. But Shukri, he has the most amazing positive attitude. He's saying something will happen, God is in charge. Something will happen eventually. We need to be patient and don't lose heart, have hope. And I'm like, you're telling me, he's great. I really hope we can do something for him and Ghassan, Mohammed Al-Mazain. So those are three of the ones from the Holy Land case that we're working on. I'm also about to file three other ones in the Southern District of New York. One is for Mohammed Salah, and he was convicted in a very early sting operation in 1993, pre 9/11. Most of our cases are post 9/11, but this was a pre 9/11 case where he didn't even do anything. There was this informant. There was some people that were talking about maybe doing something, and Muhammad didn't even know them. He owned a couple of gas stations in New York City, and he was asked to sell fuel oil to these people and given some hint that they might be planning something, but he wasn't part of that. And he sold them fuel, sold, not gave, he didn't, they called him a financier in the case. All he did was sell them gas like he would to anybody, fuel oil. That was it. And he was offered a 5-year sentence before trial. And this is back in like 1993, 94. His lawyer said, don't worry, we can beat this. They don't have any evidence against you. So he didn't take the deal, got convicted at trial, had Judge Mukasey, who's terrible, and he gave him 35 years. So he has a bunch of more, he has about 3 more years if he doesn't get released now. He's about to turn 65. He has hypertension, some other underlying health conditions, and he would be deported anyway. So if we do get him out, he'll have to deal with ICE. And he's just like the sweetest guy. We met his daughter, who had her mother had kept her away from him while she was growing up. But she eventually found him when she grew up and started visiting him in prison. And she came to our family conferences a couple of times. She has 3 young kids now and is struggling a lot financially. But she wrote a great letter. I have a great picture of the 2 of them together that I'm going to put in the motion. So we're doing his, and then we're doing a couple of other ones, which I don't know if I have. Maybe, how much time do we have? I don't know if I should talk about the other ones or if we want to go into questions or what.
Kathy, we have someone on Facebook Live asking to speak about the Duca brothers.
Asking them to speak or me to speak?
You.
Oh, okay. So that's not a compassionate release case, but that is a case that we are involved with. But before I talk about them, I wanted to mention that we are also working with another attorney who's working for us on this, Amit Gupta, and he's also preparing a couple of these petitions and probably will do more eventually. He's about to file one for Samir Hassoun, which is a sting case, a ridiculous sting case out of Chicago. And he's not very old, but he does have this disease called familial Mediterranean fever, which is an autoimmune disease, and it does put him at risk for COVID. It's a very rare disease, so it's not mentioned in the CDC guidelines, but it clearly is an autoimmune disease and would put him at risk. So Amit is about to file for him soon. And all right, so the Duca case is a crazy case where there's 3 Duca brothers, and then there were 2 other people, Mohammed Shnur and Saidar Tartar. But the 3 Duca brothers and Mohammed Shnur were entrapped in another sting operation that the Duca brothers didn't even know about, really. It was one informant talking to Mohammed Shnur about something at Fort Dix. The Duca brothers had no knowledge of that, and Mohammed was just entrapped by the informant. The Duca brothers wanted guns so they could go to a public shooting range and use them, but they weren't allowed to have guns because they were undocumented. So that was a crime for them to get guns. And okay, so that's an unfair crime, but that was what they were guilty of, was getting guns, not any kind of terrorism. They had nothing to do with any kind of conspiracy, but they were convicted of conspiracy for things that were talked about, totally vague, no plot, no anything. And they even said they weren't going to do it, that they weren't interested. They got life sentences, as did Mohammed Shnur. And they're not we're not doing compassionate release motions for them because they are not eligible according to any of the guidelines, including they're not at risk for COVID because they're young and healthy. But what we are doing is they already had a post-conviction motion in the courts. They actually got a life sentence on the conspiracy charge, and an additional, this is 2 of the Duca brothers, Dritan Duca and Shane Duca. They got a life sentence on this ridiculous conspiracy charge and an additional 30 years consecutive to life, if that makes any sense, which it doesn't, for possessing a firearm in connection with the crime of violence. Well, what's the crime of violence? Well, it turns out that the Supreme Court said over the last couple of years that it was a couple of cases that charge, the way it was in their case, is unconstitutional because it was too vague. The conspiracy was too vague too. Unfortunately, they didn't say that's unconstitutional, but they said this gun charge for the 30-year sentence is unconstitutional. So we're going back to court. We took over the case and we're about to file our reply memorandums. Steve Downs and I are representing G10 and Shane. And we're going to get rid of that extra 30 years. So there's some progress. We're trying to go after the life sentence as well and get that thrown out as well, but that's much more difficult. So, and the judge doesn't like them, but we're trying, and we're at least making some progress in that case, I think.
Okay, thank you so much, Kathy. We do have a few questions. Cindy on, let's see, Zoom said, thanks, Daniel. A lot of our comrades at the BOP are really upset about the lockdowns, and we know that they are enforced differentially. Can you talk about this? What is your perspective on wide-scale lockdowns? Also wondering if you have any info on treatments. We heard a lot of people don't report symptoms, which Mel kind of talked about, I believe, because they don't want to go to the SHU. We don't know anyone yet who has been tested, so we don't know what happens when people are suspected or sick.
Well, I'm not sure I totally understand the question. The lockdowns are gnarly. They're not fun. It's hard for me to know what the alternative, like if you had business as usual at the prisons with people commingling constantly, I actually think that probably wouldn't be very good in terms of spreading disease. So like the lockdowns, I think when it first happened, I thought to myself that the government, like, that's the tool they have, and it's the tool they use for everything. And it's usually too long, too severe. But I'm not sure what the alternative is to a lockdown necessarily. I mean, really the alternative is like depopulation of the prison. I mean, a significant amount of people would have to be released from prison in order to make that environment safe. I'm also not in the business of really wanting to make prisons safe per se. Like, we have limited energy. I don't want to make the prisons run better. That said, I don't really have a good answer for you. I don't know what the alternative is to a short-term lockdown. I think the BOP will probably keep that lockdown longer than anyone. Like, they're not looking at it from a public health perspective at all. They're really just looking like they are a hammer and everything is a nail. So lockdown and incident reports is what they know. It's all they know. And so I don't know how to get around it. The problem is that prison is just such a rigid system that if the only two choices are business as usual and lockdown, I mean, neither one of those are necessarily good. So yeah, sorry, that's a tough one.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I also knew the lockdowns would happen immediately, but we know it's not a solution. We have another question here, which Kathy can answer. It says, are you eligible for compassionate release if you have a detainer to be deported?
Yeah, you are. I answered it on the Facebook page, I think, but yes, the thing is, you're not eligible for home confinement if you have a detainer, or if you're going to face ICE detention. If you're not a citizen, you're not eligible for home confinement which is something that the BOP can grant and hasn't been. But you are eligible for compassionate release. Under the First Step Act, there's no exclusions based on the crime of conviction or citizenship from the First Step Act compassionate release. You can look at what the different criteria are for whether a judge is going to grant it or not in terms of medical and age and now the COVID risk. But there's no exclusions from it. Everybody is eligible. They're not excluded from it based on their conviction or their citizenship status.
Are there any other questions before we wrap up? I'll give people a few minutes to chime in at the end. For those who participated and listened, I want to thank everyone. I hope that if you weren't previously aware of us as an organization, that we have helped change the stigma around people who have a terrorism conviction, and that it's not always as it seems. In fact, it's hardly ever what it seems. And if you like the work we're doing, if you want to support Kathy's program for compassionate release for these people in the pandemic in our prisons, don't forget to donate to us. And we just urge people to get involved. If prison reform is important to you, if you have a loved one in prison, even if you don't and you're just a concerned citizen, one thing the average person can do is write to their lawmakers, write to the head of the BOP, contact the local news stations in your area to cover the prison conditions in your state. The more noise you make, the more attention gets to the people who we call them the silent victims, because they don't have the ability to hop on email and make phone calls and Google stuff for their own safety. We have to do that for them. So we just got another message. Is someone like Shifa eligible for home confinement?
No, because Shiva has a terrorism-related conviction. Unfortunately, he's not.
Okay.
And it's been confusing because when Barr did his memo, he basically said, look at everybody, if they're vulnerable to the virus. But then BOP, when they implemented it, they came up with all these exclusions, including anything terrorism related.
I did a little numerical analysis of how many people are excluded based on just a few of the criteria, and it's pretty stunning. I mean, the amount of people that are in the BOP for what they consider a violent charge is like 35,000. The number of non-citizens in the BOP, which you have to presume all of them would have ICE detainers, is 31,000, and that's just ICE detainers. Anyone with a state case, a county case, a child support detainer, there's millions of detainers that mess up anything. I mean, let's say you had a misdemeanor charge in somewhere that could actually affect your halfway house placement. It could affect eligibility for home confinement. And when you throw in the sex offenses, that's 13,000 other people. And then when you consider how many people have an incident report in the last year, I don't know how much that is. They don't keep stats, of course, but it's probably significant. It's very easy to get incident reports in prison. You can get one for talking back. That's the one I got. So.
All right. We have a couple more questions. Now that AB thinks that lying to the FBI isn't a crime, can we use that to our advantage here? I think that's more of a commentary than a question. And also, can you speak about Imam Jalil Al-Amin?
I mean, he's a state prisoner, so he's not eligible for federal compassionate release or federal anything. He's a state prisoner from Georgia held in the federal system because his conviction is for, he's accused of killing a Georgia cop. And so there are a number of different people that are held in the BOP that are technically not federal prisoners, and their jurisdiction is their state. Sundiata Acoli is another one of those people. He's from New Jersey. So the jurisdictional things can be confusing at times, and it's also important, like Ashley was saying, to reach out to representatives. When we're talking about BOP, you're reaching out to your two U.S. senators and your congressional rep. Your state people have no play. Like occasionally a state person might talk about a local facility, but like really they're out of their lane, and it's mostly show at that point. So like on Twitter, I don't believe that these people have any value, but I will tag Schumer and Gillibrand on anything I post about the BOP. They show no interest in looking at the BOP, but I still figure, well, they're my locals. I might as well. It's like no harm done.
And I just wanted to give a quick shout out to a local organization here in DC, Sue Udry with Defending Rights in Dissent. If you're on our Facebook Live, you'll see that she commented, she posted a link. She wanted to share the graphic novel that they published on FBI manufactured terror plots, including the Newburgh Five. Anyone interested, I urge them to please check out that link. We've also linked our Inventing Terrorists report. What it is I think, the most extensive research done on these cases. And it's a comprehensive report about the cases that the Coalition for Civil Freedoms supports, and the inmates that we are trying to protect during this COVID-19. And if there's not anything else, I just want to thank everyone again. Thank you, Daniel, Mel, Kathy, for speaking. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.